Hey, good morning, everybody, or whatever time it is when you're watching this. It is very early morning here, so sorry. I've got coffee. All right. So, this is the last portion of Module 4. It's week 3, and we're going to use it to talk about secondary data, about code books, and about levels of measurement. Remember also, just procedurally, that after you finish the materials for this week, that's when you're going to have the Module 4 quiz. And I know I've said this a bunch of times, but just in case you hadn't heard it or didn't remember, it's slightly longer than the other quizzes. It's 15 multiple choice questions instead of your usual 10, and then it's 7 short answers instead of your usual 5, so make sure you leave yourself enough time for that. All right. So the topics for this week, and there are 2 of them, will feel slightly disconnected, but they're really important to learn together and to understand together. The first of them is secondary data. A bunch of you are using secondary data for your research projects for the semester. I'm going to go over what it is. I'm going to go over why people use secondary data, things to be cautious about when you use them, and then actually give you some examples. And then the second topic is about code books. We use code books whether we have primary data or secondary data. No matter what, when we're collecting data or using data, we develop our own code books. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them in the mini lectures, but they are really important to understand. Data are not useful unless you have a good code book that accompanies them. So make sure you spend a bit of time on them, both in the book. I think the book does a really nice job with code books, and also in like the textbook reading, and then also as we develop our own project, I'll make sure you have a code book. So the survey that we're doing in class will have a code book that goes with it that's going to help you. Okay, and then finally I'll talk about levels of measurement for our variables, which is something that I probably should have done earlier. I think you all kind of have a general sense of it, but I'll firm it up for you, give you definitions, and sort of clarify what it is I've been talking about, and then fill in any blank spaces. Okay. Secondary data, as a reminder, are data collected by somebody else that you go out and obtain in order to reanalyze. By definition, these data are subject to the same biases as any primary data collection, but there are a lot of secondary data out there that are well done and well documented. And so if you believe there are likely biases, you can identify them and statistically control for them. Primary data collection takes time, it takes money. And so in general, to the extent that you can simply use data that somebody else has put together for your research, you should always feel free to do that. If the data and the variables you need exist and you believe that they are useful data and good data in that they're valid and reliable, then go ahead and use them. I think your focus in deciding to use secondary data should be to ensure that you really understand everything about how the data were collected. And that way you understand the limitations of the data, you understand how to correctly analyze the data, you understand how to interpret the results of the data. So it's sort of totally fine to use the data, but it's really important that you understand the data really well as if you had collected it yourself. That's where the code books come in. There are literally thousands of data sets about political questions that students and researchers can use. It's common practice in social science and any science to make your data freely and publicly available to the extent that you can. And so it's pretty common to be able to, if you read a paper and like the data, go to the author's website and just download the replication data. If you cannot find data for an article that you're interested in accessing, there are ways to go about getting it. Just shoot me a message and we'll set up a meeting and I'll talk you through other ways to go about doing that. Okay. Sorry, I kicked over a pile of papers under my desk. All right. So there are tons of data out there. If there's particular data that you are looking for any of your research projects and I can help you find it, I'm happy to always do that. Always feel free to ask. What else? Okay, once you have your data, you're going to put it all together and store it in a data set. A data set is a listing of every observation as your row and every variable as your column. So if your unit of observation is a certain country in a certain year, then each row would be a country in a year. So this row would be United States in 2020. And then there'd be a variable in each column. So if this variable is GDP, and the next variable is population, and the next variable is whatever they are from there, then the next row is United States in 2019. It's a different unit because it's a different year, country year pair. US 2020 is not the same as US 2019. And I know that because the variables are different. GDP in the next one is going to be a different observation, a different data point than GDP in the next year. Population changes from one year to another, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And then let me give you one more row in this imaginary code book. US in 2020, US in 2019, Canada in 2020. Different country, same year, but because we're looking at the country and the year, it's a different observation. It gets its own row, and Canada's 2020 GDP and Canada 2020's population and so on. That's how a data set is set up. Observations in the rows, variables in the columns. What the code book does is tell us how to read what is in the data set. So each code book gives us basic information about the database. And that information includes the name of the database, descriptive information, so who developed it, when they developed it, what their institutions were when they developed it, etc. Think of it like a title page or an author page with identifying information. The source of the data, if a data set only has one source, you list the source there. And then the format is either a table or it's a listing per variable. So some data sets will have a table where the row will be like a variable name, and then it has a description of the variable and the measurement, right? You'll see examples of that. And some have a listing per variable. So imagine like a text document where you have in bold like a dictionary, but each word that you're defining is a variable. So you have the variable name in bold, and then you have a description of what it is. And then you have another variable name in bold and a description of what it is. So a list table or a listing for each variable. Sometimes code books will also contain descriptive statistics for each variable. So sometimes a code book will have not just what the variable is, what it's measuring, and its coding scheme, right? So 0 equals no, 1 equals yes, for example. But sometimes it also contains descriptive, so the minimum, the maximum, the mean or median, and the standard deviation, just so people have a sense of what the distribution of the variable actually is in the data set, as well as understanding what it's measuring. All right. When I say it has the description of the variable, like each part of the codebook, whether it's a row or an entry, has a description of the variable. For every variable in a data set, the codebook is going to tell us the variable name, the variable description, the source if the data set has more than one source, and also the coding. That's pretty straightforward, right? Okay. Oh, let me go back. I said the source if the data set has only one source, but I meant if the data set has more than one source. So if all of the data in your data set comes from one place, then you can just tell us basic information on the front page of the codebook what that source is. If every variable or some variables come from different data sets, so there's more than one source for your full data set, then you're going to put the source of each variable in the codebook. And that way each variable can come from a different place, or one of them can come from a different place, or anything in between, and we know where it is because each source is in the description of that variable. Okay, this is useful. So if you look at this slide, you see an example codebook. The information is really simple, right? But it's organized clearly and systematically. So first you have the header row at the top going from left to right. It's got the white text on the blue background. And then under that, each variable gets its own row. It gets a spot for its name, a spot for a brief description, a spot for the source, which is, if I haven't been clear about that, the place where you found the information you're recording. And then finally, it has the scheme or the rules or the system that you're using to code the variable. So for example, when I say code, what I mean is turn it from information into a number that signals the information, but like mathematically. All right. So the first variable in this codebook is gender. And specifically, it's a variable that records the gender of the person about whom we're collecting data. It's this individual observation. And I get this information from a survey that I gave a bunch of students. So the individual observation is not just a person, it is a particular survey respondent. And when I sit down to code data from that survey, the first piece of data I'm going to code is that respondent's gender. If they reported it as female, I code that as a 1. If they reported it as male, I code that as a 2. And if they reported it as non-binary, I code that as a 3. Okay, the next variable is age. When I talk about age, I'm talking about the year in which they were born. And I get this information from the same survey that I'm using to get gender information. So the source is the same. Each of my observations is a different person responding to the same survey. Year is already a number, and so rather than having a 1, 2, 3 coding rule here, I'm just going to code the year of birth, nice and simple. Okay, the final variable in the codebook is GPA. GPA here means GPA in their current degree program, but you can imagine in other research, maybe it means overall GPA or undergraduate GPA as opposed to your GPA in graduate courses or in graduate school, for example, right? And that, by the way, is why a clear description is so important. So GPA here means one thing, and in other places it's going to mean something else. And if you want to be clear on what you mean so that other people can get and use your data, or if you want to be able to access and use other people's data and know what they meant by GPA, it's really important to have a codebook that makes this super clear. Okay, I don't want to ask survey respondents for their GPAs for lots of reasons, right? Imagine somebody asking you your GPA and the multiple feelings that you would have about it before you answered them. I don't want to do that. But I do have each respondent's name, and so with their permission, I can get their GPAs from student records and files. Right? And then right next to their gender and their birth year, I can put each individual student's numeric GPA, so 3.00 or whatever. When you put in this information cleanly and carefully, one row for each observation, you get a data set. And when you write the code book first so that you have a plan to follow in order to input the data systematically and validly and reliably, and when you want to publish your research and other people want to look at or extend your research, you have a way to do, or a way for them to do that validly and reliably as well. So data sets are where we take our information and put it together so we can analyze it to answer our hypothesis or test our hypotheses, answer our research questions. Code books are the resources we put together so that we know what we were doing when we put together our data set. And those are the fundamental pieces you need to understand and start being able to work through using secondary data. And I will see you next time.